Take a second to look around your room right now. You likely have running water, a solid roof, and a device that connects you to the entire world. We often complain about slow internet or high prices, but we forget how lucky we actually are. Most of the luxuries we depend on daily didn't even exist a century ago. It makes you wonder what life was like for those born 1,000 or even 10,000 years ago. The truth is, history isn't just a series of dates. It's a collection of some of the most brutal and terrifying eras imaginable. In this video, we're exploring the time periods that would make our modern problems look like a vacation. From empires crumbling into total chaos to global winters that blocked out the sun, these are the absolute worst times to have been alive.
Most people know that the Roman Empire eventually fell, but we rarely discuss the messy aftermath. The years between 450 and 700 AD were a nightmare of shifting power and constant fear. When the central government finally vanished, it left behind a massive power vacuum that everyone was desperate to fill. Suddenly, the institutions that provided safety, like the military, banks, and legal systems, were completely gone. If you lived in Europe during this transition, you were witnessing the death of the old world and the birth of a much more violent one. Without a centralized army to protect the borders, barbarian tribes like the Goths and Huns saw an easy target. They knew the eternal city was no longer a threat, leading to decades of raids, destruction, and a complete collapse of the trade networks that kept society functioning.
Let's fast forward to a more recent stretch of history that was arguably just as devastating. If you were born around 1898, your life would be defined by a series of global disasters. By the time you reached adulthood, you'd likely be drafted into the horrors of World War I. We're talking about years spent in muddy trenches, facing machine guns and chemical weapons. But the end of the war wasn't the end of the pain. In 1918, a massive global pandemic broke out, taking the lives of over 50 million people. It targeted the young and healthy, sometimes ending a life in just 48 hours. Just as the world started to recover in the 1920s, the economy completely imploded in 1929. The Great Depression wasn't just about losing money, it was about a total loss of hope. Unemployment skyrocketed to 25%, and families were forced into breadlines just to survive another day.
Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun had lost its shine. In the year 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption triggered what experts call a volcanic winter. For 18 months, a thick veil of ash and dust blocked the sunlight across Europe and Asia. Temperatures plummeted, and the sky remained dark even in the middle of the afternoon. Crops failed globally, leading to a famine so severe that entire civilizations were pushed to the brink of extinction. In China, it actually snowed during the summer months, destroying the food supply and causing mass starvation. To make matters worse, this was the same era that saw the arrival of the Justinianic plague. Tens of millions of people died from the disease while they were already struggling to find food in a world without sunlight. It was a literal dark age that lasted for years, scarring the planet for over a century.
In the mid-14th century, Europe faced what might be the most famous disaster in history. The Black Death arrived in 1347, and within just 4 years it had wiped out nearly half of the entire population. Imagine looking at your friends and family and realizing that every other person would be gone. The scale of the loss is almost impossible to grasp. Some estimates suggest that up to 200 million people perished globally during this outbreak. There was no cure, no understanding of germs, and no way to stop the spread. It felt like the end of the world was happening in real time for everyone involved. The social impact was just as heavy as the death toll. Labor shortages caused the economy to shatter, and the psychological trauma changed human culture for generations to come. Living through this meant constant terror, as the person standing next to you could be carrying a death sentence.
While Europe struggled with plagues, the indigenous people of the Americas faced a different kind of catastrophe starting in 1492. The arrival of European explorers brought diseases that the native populations had no defense against. Smallpox and other illnesses acted like an unintentional biological weapon. Reports suggest that up to 95% of the indigenous population was wiped out. That's 55 million lives lost, not just to sickness, but to the violence and displacement that followed. An entire way of life was systematically dismantled in a matter of decades. The survivors were forced off their ancestral lands and watched as their cultures were erased. It was a period of profound tragedy that still impacts the world today. For the people living through it, it wasn't just a transition, it was the total destruction of their reality.
If we go back even further, long before humans existed, there was a time called the Carboniferous period. The atmosphere was 35% oxygen, which sounds healthy until you realize it turned the entire planet into a tinderbox. Massive forest fires would rage for years, fueled by the highly flammable air. But the real horror was the wildlife. In this oxygen-rich environment, insects grew to terrifying, monstrous sizes. There were dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and millipedes that were over 3 feet long. If you have a fear of bugs, this would be your ultimate nightmare. The world was also dominated by giant spiders the size of a human head, and the oceans were ruled by primitive sharks. It was a beautiful, lush, green world, but it was also a place where a human would be at the bottom of the food chain. Nature was oversized and incredibly dangerous. Looking back at these different eras, it's clear that humanity has survived some truly impossible conditions. Whether it was the collapse of empires, global plagues, or prehistoric monsters, our ancestors endured things we can barely imagine. It really puts our current struggles into perspective. While our world is far from perfect, we aren't dealing with 18 months of darkness or a plague that kills half of our neighbors. History shows us that things can always be worse, and we should probably be a bit more grateful for the era we actually live in. So, which of these time periods do you think would be the hardest to survive? Would you rather face the giant insects or the dark winter of 536 AD? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to check out our other videos. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.